After their seizure of power, the Bolsheviks often found themselves hanging by a thread as their enemies came close to toppling their regime. But, as history would have it, they ultimately beat the odds. Why the Bolsheviks won the Russian Civil War was not solely because of luck. Lenin played his cards well and outmatched his opponents. Public support was crucial for anyone wanting to take over Russia. While the Bolsheviks certainly had their supporters, they were not overwhelmingly loved. In fact, at times they were very unpopular. The result of the election for the Constituent Assembly gives us a good idea of just how much support Lenin had. The Bolsheviks received between 22 and 25% of the vote, making them the second largest party in the assembly. Both the right and left wings of the Socialist Revolutionary Party received between 39 and 45% of the vote. Taking into consideration the SR's close association to non-Russian parties, you might as well consider their vote to have been 58%. Despite that, the Bolsheviks, not the SRs, were the ones who took over Russia. Even though they didn't have majority support, it was where that support was coming from that mattered most. The Bolsheviks received most of their support from the urban proletariat, the Red Guards, and soldiers. Aside from possessing more weapons, these groups were mostly located in the Russian core, mockingly referred to as Sovdepia. This area was home to Russia's largest cities of Petrograd and Moscow. This was the heart of Russian industry, and the workers gave it to the Bolsheviks. The Socialist Revolutionaries obtained most of their support from the peasantry. Though numerous, the peasants were hard to organize and unreliable. When the SRs of the right established a short-lived government called Komuch along the Volga, they were hard-pressed to find anyone willing to fight for them. Out of a population of around 14 million, only 8,000 men volunteered from the cities to fight in the so-called People's Army. As for the peasants, they only provided 2,000 volunteers. Suffice to say, the peasantry were reluctant to fight. Their only worry was defending the revolution in their villages, not the whole of Russia. They viewed the Civil War as a conflict between urban political parties, something that didn't concern them. When Komuch finally resorted to conscription, only 1 out of 3 men showed up for service. The reluctance of the peasantry to fight was simply because their world didn't extend beyond their villages. Also is the fact that Russian peasants were less literate than urban workers, likely explaining their short-sighted view of the world. Urban workers enjoyed greater access to newspapers and other reading material that covered social and political subjects. Suffice to say, Bolshevik supporters were, on average, better educated and more informed on the wider world. It didn't matter that there weren't many of them, only that they were loyal and reliable. Also of importance was that the Bolsheviks could pacify large portions of the population. Their promises of bread, land, peace, and all power to the Soviets were very enticing. Even though they often failed to deliver these promises, they were still largely preferred over the whites. Part of the reason they were able to obtain enough support has to do with their leadership. It cannot be stressed enough just how important Lenin was. Though it may not always seem, Lenin was incredibly smart, and his pragmatism saved the Bolsheviks on numerous occasions. He was also very charismatic and an excellent speaker, capable of simplifying complicated subjects. Not to forget that he was also a workaholic. Lenin took very little time off and didn't sleep much. In the end, his complete lack of self-care basically killed him. But during the Civil War, this was momentarily advantageous. People followed Lenin not for his ideology, but for the strength of his character. Without Lenin, the Bolsheviks would never have gotten enough support to take over Russia, nor would they have even had the opportunity to do so. At Lenin's side were also several capable followers, one of the most famous being Leon Trotsky. Trotsky was for the Red Army what Lenin was for the party. He himself was also charismatic and a good speaker, making countless trips to the front to encourage the troops. His presence during the Battle of Petrograd in 1919 was arguably the reason why the city held out. He arrived on his famous armored train and began rallying the defenders to defy the odds. Trotsky's impact on morale has been credited with saving Petrograd when its capture seemed inevitable. Even though he lacked military experience, Trotsky quickly became the driving force behind the professionalization and centralization of the Red Army. It was he who organized it and turned it into a proper force, even as the so-called military opposition tried to interfere. The whites really had no equivalent to Lenin and Trotsky, at least in terms of personality. It really goes to show just how important strong leaders are during times of hardship. Continuing with the subject of leadership, Lenin was forced to make very hard but also necessary decisions. His pragmatism was best displayed when the Bolsheviks signed the Treaty of Brest-Litovsk. The conditions were incredibly brutal, forcing the Bolsheviks to give up a vast territory and all its riches. To agree to terms like these is akin to political suicide, but Lenin faced the humiliation, even threatening to resign if the Central Committee didn't support him. Lenin knew that the Bolsheviks could not withstand a German invasion, and that there was no hope of being saved by a revolution in the West. He agreed to the terms because it was the only way to ensure the survival of the Soviet regime. Aside from peace, Lenin also managed to secure a donation of 200,000 rifles and 500 million rounds of ammunition from the Germans, making it the only significant contribution of foreign aid to the Bolsheviks during this time. Cooperating with the Germans ultimately paid off, as the treaty allowed the Red Army to focus inwards against internal threats. Lenin knew when he had the cards and when he didn't, stopping himself from overplaying his hand. Another display of Lenin's pragmatism was when he agreed to let Trotsky recruit former Tsarist officers for the Red Army. Lenin had initially aligned more with the military opposition, but conceded to Trotsky out of necessity. This was an example of how Lenin could put aside his own politics when necessary. The issue of national determination was something the Bolsheviks handled quite well. When capable, they had no problem forcing non-Russians into joining them, abolishing the independence of several short-lived states. Even then, they still granted minorities a degree of cultural autonomy, which helped to pacify them. Unlike the Whites, the Bolsheviks understood that they couldn't keep Russia one and indivisible, accepting the loss of territories when necessary. The recognition of independence for Finland and the Baltic states is a good example. These countries were very much hostile to Soviet power and often collaborated with the White movement. However, during the attack on Petrograd, none of these countries joined in, for the simple reason that the Whites refused to recognize their independence. The Bolsheviks, on the other hand, did, and successfully neutralized them as a threat. After the October Revolution, the Bolsheviks had a several-month head start to begin building their new government. This brief period of peace meant that they could establish institutions and a bureaucracy to administer the territory they controlled. The new Soviet state also inherited the Tsarist bureaucracy of Central Russia, and, through oppression, killed or incarcerated any potential enemies. Not only that, but the Bolsheviks could rely on the support of the socialist intelligentsia. Educated and literate, the intelligentsia made for great bureaucrats to run the state. Though Bolshevik management of the economy was very inefficient, they were still capable of allocating resources where needed. The Whites, on the other hand, were forced to set up their own governments whilst under fire. What was arguably the main reason for the Bolshevik victory was that they controlled the immense resources of Sovdepia. To quote historian Evan Mawdsley on its importance, the core territory of Sovdepia was the largest chunk of the population of the old empire. It was mostly Great Russian in nationality. It contained most of the war industry, most establishments and stores of the old army and navy. Gaining and keeping control of this heartland in 1917 and 1918 was the decisive achievement of the Civil War. Moscow, too, was the center of communication, which enabled the embattled Reds to defeat their isolated enemies one by one. They also controlled a vast territory and could give up ground without being seriously threatened. The Bolsheviks could always conscript more peasants to replace their losses. With no foreign support, they could just build their own weapons. They could make promises to minorities that they didn't govern. If things got tough, the Red Army could always retreat and rush reinforcements to the front. By the end of the Civil War, the Bolsheviks could metaphorically smother the Whites to death under the weight of all their resources. Last but not least, we have to discuss the Red Army. The fact that the Bolsheviks were able to build a massive military under apocalyptic conditions is part of the reason why they won the Civil War. Sovdepia's massive reserves of manpower meant that they could field millions of soldiers. Even if most of them weren't combat troops, they almost always outnumbered their enemies. As stated, the recruitment of Tsarist officers was crucial. These specialists, as they were called, weren't just fighting on the front lines. An emphasis was placed on recruiting general staff officers needed to administer and command the Red Army. The military training of the officers was complemented by the political commissars. The commissars were tasked with keeping an eye on the officers to make sure they didn't defect. They were also crucial at maintaining discipline and morale in an army increasingly made up of conscripts. For the most part, officers and commissars worked well together, forming enduring friendships that kept their units combat effective. Many Tsarist officers became renowned for their part in the Bolshevik victory. Mikhail Bonch-Burovich was crucial in helping Trotsky organize the Red Army. Mikhail Tuashevsky was a leading commander during the campaigns in Siberia, and later helped develop what is called Deep Battle Doctrine that beat back the Nazis in World War II. Semyon Budyonny was the famous commander of the 1st Cavalry Army that saved Moscow and cornered the Whites in Crimea. Not to forget that future World War II heroes like Georgy Zhukov, Ivan Konev, and Semyon Timoshenko first rose to prominence in the lower ranks during this time. The Red Army had many great leaders that were more than a match for their white counterparts. The main difference was that the Red commanders had a lot more resources. The Red Army was also quick to improvise and adapt when needed. A good example is when the Cossack cavalry of Denikin threatened Moscow. The Bolsheviks regarded cavalry as outdated and a symbol of the upper classes. But when the Whites showed them just how effective cavalry still was, the Red Army was quick to organize their own cavalry that outnumbered and beat the Whites back at their own game. Overall, the Bolsheviks owed their victory to the resources of Sovdepia, a reliable base of support and strong leadership. Though Lenin made his share of mistakes and the Red Army suffered many setbacks, what mattered most was that they outperformed the people they were fighting. The Bolsheviks won because they made the best of a bad situation, knowing when to push and when to compromise. Even though they failed to spread the revolution abroad, which was one of their main objectives, the Bolsheviks at least ensured the survival of Soviet power in Russia. If you like this video, then you can stick around because I'll probably make another one focusing on the defeat of the White Movement. I also have other topics I want to cover. If you want to support the channel, then feel free to subscribe. Better yet, you can donate me money on my Ko-fi page. Anyways, take care and have a nice day. Goodbye.